and most specifically in 93. So that is when AOL, yes, remember AOL? AOL comes online, and essentially overnight, millions of Americans are now connected to the internet. Very slow, but they are connected to the internet. This ends up creating more revenue competition, where now advertisers have another place to throw their dollars. This strips money away from the news networks, including CNN. Also, the internet leads to alternate sources that begin to undermine the credibility of the news network. Things that didn't exist before, the idea of fake news, now becomes real. We get actual video proof that things that people thought were honest to goodness things going on air were actually staged. One of the more famous ones being the CNN reporters supposedly on the roof of a building during Scud missile attacks in Saudi, when the uh, broadcaster's like scrambling to put his mask on, and it turns out they weren't in Saudi at all, and they were never in any danger, and it was all faked. Um, this period is also the beginning of Fox and MSNBC, 1996 timeframe. Fox brings in a new version of conservatism. Because no particular network was devoted to the idea of conservatism before this, uh, it becomes a blueprint for what conservative has to be. There are other forms out there, there are other philosophies, there are people who don't agree with Fox's version of conservatism. However, since it's the only one out there, it's the template that basically people rally around. This conservative network causes further drift to the left for the other networks, because as they're stripping away righties to Fox, uh, the remaining networks feel they need to go left to basically pull in new or additional audience to make up for the conservatives who are going away. Now, this is actually the beginning of a rift that starts forming in the establishment. Now, there are always factions, but most of the time, at least through a large chunk of our history, these factions are very hard to see and behind the scenes. Uh, this causes an energization of establishment dissidents. Now, these dissidents don't really have a solid banner because to the world, conservatism is Fox News. Yet there's a lot of people who don't completely agree with this. So this grouping of dissidents is a loose grouping, and it has no central focus. During the same period, we have the rise of individual websites with unique topics. Forums are huge and they skyrocket, allowing people to exchange information back and forth. Of course, this has the impact of allowing information to appear that has never appeared before. It allows people to question things as they've never done before. And it allows people to basically put uh, at guano level ideas out to the public. And with people without critical thinking skills buy into a lot of things they probably shouldn't. So if we advance a little bit further into the 2000s, 2005, we have the rise of YouTube and Twitter. Now, the ability of the individual to produce content is like never before. Before, it was a struggle to put a website together and you had to have a certain level of expertise. In order to use Twitter or YouTube, you need no expertise at all. During this time frame, we saw a rise of a whole bunch of different uh, online news organizations that were meant to be the new wave of news information. However, this was short-lived. We ended up with a rise and very rapid fall of this independent journalism. Competition was fierce because there were so many different platforms out there, and uh, ad revenue was very contentious because a lot of companies who wanted to advertise were desperately trying to figure out how this new medium worked. What was the fine line between getting your product advertised and influencing this new media to say what you wanted to say? And of course, we have lots of badly sourced information, opinion as fact, and then the rise of clickbait. Uh, Clickbait, of course, being the idea of throwing a headline that may have nothing to do with the story behind it. Uh, and people using that as their understanding of what's going on. Clickbait eventually becomes legitimate news. Now, advertisers would quickly subvert these poorly financed operations because since the competition was so fierce, these organizations were desperate for cash and thus were very quickly corralled into saying things that the advertisers wanted them to say. One of the things that rose in this clickbait era, which hasn't technically ended, but the clickbait era as we understand it for the mid 2000s and early 2000s, one of the things that popped up in there was the idea of hyping racism. The Democratic Party found it could do fantastic fundraising on the idea of hyping racism and the idea that there was a vast racist army forming out there that needed to be fought. Uh, this idea that racism was on the rise was essentially fed through a lot of these clickbait media organizations, almost like agitprop, agitation propaganda. And this clickbait fed the idea to the left that racism was worse than it ever had been. So a weird thing happens. 2008 happens. Barack Obama is elected president. And this ends up having a completely unexpected effect because now the left came to the conclusion that racism had been decisively defeated. Otherwise, how could Obama be president? And they started getting into this idea that they had reached the end of history. And the concept of the end of history means they had culminated. It's almost like the coming of the millennium, the thousand-year reign. They believed that all resistance to progress was gone. Uh, Essentially, the press went into a cycle of total adulation for Barack Obama. There was no particularly meaningful reporting on him other than he was the greatest human being who had ever lived. However, this adulation press uh, was a dying model. If everything that needs to be said has been said, occurred, there's no reason for people to follow these news items. Without the racist undertones to drive the clickbait to get people worked up, to get them to uh, go through the clickbait, to do fundraising and funnel money into the Democratic Party based on race. We essentially have a system where many of the new internet sites were reduced to shallow hulls very rapidly. Uh, Advertising money was gushing out of legacy media. So then we have the rise of the 2016 election. And what's going to be happening in this election is the coronation of Hillary Clinton. Because of this mindset of that the end of history had been reached, uh, the establishment was so convinced that whatever they wanted to happen would happen that they could not conceive of anything other than a Hillary Clinton victory. So the fun part is here is the media is desperate to come up with some form of new clickbait. So their new clickbait is Donald Trump. Trump, either through just the sheer accident of the personality he was projecting, or a deliberate attempt to essentially troll the media into promoting him, the media uses Donald Trump as their new source of clickbait. And it starts working. They get the money starting to flow back in. They're getting viewership. So the advertisers are coming back. Now, if you recall this period, everyone in the establishment was mocking Trump. They were just ridiculing him. I recall one of the late night comedians going, when they found out he was going to run, he was screaming, bring it, at the top of his lungs, like it was the most ridiculous thing ever. So, what do you think in the comments below? Uh, Anything not ring as correct as you'd like in terms of how I characterize the march of media? Did I miss some elements that might be useful for people to understand this? Well, let me know in the comments below. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithms brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, look at my other titles. Please consider subscribing. And of course, if somebody who might find this interesting, share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.